And the reading one is an interesting one because, as you say, if we read widely and not directly preaching related or even Bible related stuff, ultimately that feeds into our preaching and our application, and our understanding of the world that our people are living in. They don't all live in this bubble that is limited to the. I think it was Stott who used to have a monthly meeting with a group of men, and they'd read one of the books on the top 10 bestseller list and discuss it. So they could. This is what their people are likely reading. How's that affecting their worldview and even their coming to the scriptures?
Yeah, so okay, I mean, again, it was Stott's thing about having one foot in the newspaper, one foot in the scriptures, and he was only saying that just to apply it. So I would say, I mean, again, everyone's different. So I read a lot. I mean, I'm a voracious reader, so I read about 4 or 5 books a week, and at any one time, I always have a devotional book, a book of poetry, a historical book, a contemporary issues book, a novel on the go. Sometimes other stuff as well as my more devotional reading. Now, I'm not saying that everyone should do that, but I think and it is possible that you can be a preacher without being a reader, but I think it's difficult and harder.
Yeah, I'm with you.
And so my advice would be, I think every preacher should set aside an hour a day where they do general reading.
Okay.
You know, whenever's best for you with that, I would definitely do that. The other thing is you have to be careful with this. I think maybe too many guys spend too much time on YouTube or, with Netflix or whatever. But you do need to know what your people are watching. I used to watch a lot of news, and I've just given up on that because news has just become opinion. So I read, magazines like The Spectator, or I read, left-wing stuff like The Guardian, or, more right-wing stuff or various things. Read a lot of articles. But videos as well. What are people reading? What are they watching? I think to be aware of that. And then the other thing, I think it was Lloyd Jones said about, don't just, go to the 17th century or whatever. I do think it's good to have a wide variety of reading. I always try to have at least one non-Christian book on the go, and usually I have 2 or 3.
Okay. Yep.
But initially, but I would say different people have different capacities.
Sure. Yeah.
In terms of all of that, and some things you skim read, some things you read in great intensity. So, for example, right now I'm reading Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. That's like 900 pages, 1,000 pages. Small print, really heavy actually, because it's a lot of French history, and it's certainly not like the musical at all, but utterly brilliant. So if you're that kind of person, Dostoevsky and so on, but you've not failed if you don't read Dostoevsky, but
I'd love to hear
it. Things like a lot of people will read stuff like John Grisham, and but then I would say there are key cultural books which basically every preacher must read. Now you get preachers who will distill that for you. So like on some of the transgender stuff, you've got Vaughan Roberts' little book.
Yeah.
But some of the material in that is brilliant. Rosaria Butterfield. Some of the non-Christian stuff like Doug Murray, The Madness of Crowds, really help you understand. And I'm reading something just now. What's her name? I think is it Catherine Ellis? Just on how the family is being undermined in the UN. And it's an utterly brilliant book. I mean, it's one of those books, I've stopped underlining it because I'd underline the whole thing. So there are certain books that you could save a lot of time. I've started, because I read so much, I've started doing what I call a Saturday review, where I review 3 or 4 books and a film and a piece of music. And the reason for that is very simple, to let people, especially preachers, go, yeah, no, I'm not going to bother with that one. I am going to do that one. And I think you've got to do that and get your own illustrations, because otherwise, the thing that used to always get me was you get preachers who preach on Ecclesiastes keep citing the Rolling Stones, I can't get no satisfaction. Well, that's fine.
Yeah.
but you've heard it, you've heard it 100 times, you've heard it 1,000 times.
Yeah.
You got to find your own stuff.
Sure, that's right.
With your own people.
That's
You know,
right.
so in Brora, I was aware, you know, there were people who were reading the Daily Record, the local newspaper. I would say always read the local newspaper. That's like a no-brainer.
Sure.
People who read the Times, people who watched the BBC, people who, well, nowadays news is much more polarized as well. So you've got, you know, Fox News and CNN are just opposites, you know.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, I do think the reading has to be wide. I don't know. I mean, it does seem a lot, and sometimes, you know, there are people like Don Carson who will, or Sinclair Ferguson who read phenomenal amounts. I'm not going to go and read all of Karl Barth, but Donald MacLeod read Karl Barth and told me about it, you know, and understood him.
Yes.
So things like that. Find some people you trust.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really, and you know, I'm certainly very grateful for the reviews you do, David, of books and things, and you save me a lot of time and a lot of grief sometimes, because I say I don't need to read any more of that, because Dave has told me all I need to know, that sort of thing, and that's what really helpful for some of us. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Well, I've got to a stage where, so for example, I've got to a stage where I start reading a book and you know, I'm just 2 chapters in, it's rubbish. I just think life's too short. I haven't got time.
Yeah.
You know, I might read a book with which I strongly disagree.
Yes.
But I want to, I mean, so, you know, people used to say to me about Richard Dawkins, because that's when I wrote, you know, the Dawkins letters about the God delusion. Would I recommend it to people? No, I wouldn't. I would recommend it to people who understand how a fundamentalist atheist thinks. But to be honest, I wrote the Dawkins letters. You can find out what Dawkins says in that.
Yeah.
If you're really bothered, go read it for yourself. That's fine. But I'm saying sometimes it's just not necessary.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I read a little bit, not much. For example, I read a little bit of Islamic stuff, but I much prefer to say somebody like Andy Bannister, who knows way more.
Yeah.
You know, and who's studied the Quran and so on. And
that's right.
You know, I think sometimes you're going to be discussing with someone, and it's fair enough. They'll say, "Well, have you read it yourself?" And maybe you have to do it. I mean, I read the Quran for that reason.
Yeah.
But don't ask me to read all the Hindu scriptures. Nobody reads all the Hindu scriptures.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
You know.
That's right.
And I've just, because I'm doing a fair bit of work with Chinese just now, I've just read through Confucius's Analects, and that they were fine. The commentary on them is awful.
Is that right?
You know, I just thought it was so boring. Anyway, but I did it. I endured it. I went through it because I just thought, yeah, you know, I got to find out a little bit more.
Okay.
But I don't think that in order to bear witness to Chinese people, you need to read Confucius.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But it's quite good to know somebody who does know.
That's right. And there's that advantage. You've begun to understand a little bit maybe of the background of their worldview and their understanding of things.
Yeah.
And that also shows then that you've taken an interest in them as real
people. I do think that, you know, so I mean, this is a small thing I do in terms of preaching. When I go away preaching, and of course, given my current what I'm doing just now, I do that quite a lot. So if I was to go to a country, I would read up a brief history. I mean, my wife used to get really annoyed with this because I'd go to a place and I'd talk about something. It's just like you talk as though you've lived there all your life, you know? And I hadn't. I'm just maybe just very confidently using something, you know. Yes. So, you know, I think I've preached in most of the nations in Europe, and I would use, you know, I would think about things. I mean, I'm interested in history anyway.
Sure. Yeah.
But so, for example, in France, I'm fully aware that the French atheists are probably the hardest group of people in the world. But if you could crack them, you would destroy most atheism. You know, and so you read, you know, because I read history. When I go to Ireland, I don't mention Cromwell too much as being one of my heroes. You know,
yeah, you don't alienate people straight away, do you? Yeah. When I used to travel in African countries, it was a country I didn't know anything about. I would read up about it before I went to a certain extent, and I would spend the first couple of days there talking to local folk. I used to find out what are the proverbs that you use. Because I sometimes use them as an illustration in your preaching, because again, it helps you to key into their way of thinking and their understanding. So we need that we need to do that in our own culture as well, and get to grips with it.